This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
It's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. This episode of the show is sponsored by the One for the Week newsletter. One for the Week is a free weekly newsletter that delivers to your inbox one resource related to presentation skills, writing, persuasion, or stakeholder management that you can apply right away to boost your effectiveness on campus, in the corridors of power when talking to policymakers, and across the corporate landscape. Interested in getting free insights in your inbox on Sundays that help you achieve without the overwhelm? Just go to onefortheweek.com and join more than 800 One for the Week subscribers. That's onefortheweek.com to sign up for the free One for the Week newsletter. It is my pleasure to have Dr. Amber Mace on the show today. Amber is the Chief Executive Officer of the California Council on Science and Technology, CCST, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization established in 1988 to advise the state of California on matters of science and technology. Amber has more than 2 decades of leadership experience working at the nexus of science and policy, drawing on her extensive background in environmental policy and marine ecology. Among a variety of leadership roles, Amber has served at the National Marine Sanctuary Program in San Francisco, and after completing her graduate work in ecology, as a Sea Grant Fellow in the U.S. Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. In 2011, Sunset Magazine named Amber a coastal hero. Amber earned her BA from the University of California, Berkeley, her Ph.D. in ecology from the University of California, Davis in the Bodega Marine Laboratory, and her MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Amber, there's a common thread through your professional career, really starting almost at the beginning when you taught scuba diving and other water safety measures at Berkeley. It seems like environmental policy and marine ecology have really been the main theme throughout your professional career so far. Can you share with us what attracted you to this policy area?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And I have been connected to the ocean since I was a little kid growing up in the Bay Area. And I am just so inspired when I'm near the ocean, and I wanted to study it when I went to college. And one of the best ways to connect at Berkeley for me was to learn how to do research underwater. It was their scuba diving program that really got me connected very directly to the ocean. I'd been a rower in high school, so on top of the water, but once I got to Berkeley, I got to get in the water, and that just hooked me. That was an opportunity for me to see there's so much knowledge that's being created about the ocean and so much need for that knowledge to get into the hands of policymakers. One of my first experiences at Berkeley was when I was a student in the program before I went on to become an instructor, where I had exercise that was one of the most challenging for me. And it was all about building resilience and skill underwater so that we could be self-sufficient, so that we'd be safe when we're doing research and not rely on our gear. And this one exercise is so crazy. It's called the bailout. You're in the ocean and there's a floating boat and has some lines hanging over the side of it. And they start a timer, 5 minutes. And it starts when I hook my tank to the outside of the boat, and then I hook my weight belt, and then I haul myself into the boat, and I haul my tank over and my weight belt over, and I take off my fins and I take off my mask, and I grab all of this and I turn the air off on my tank, and I grab all of this in my arms, and then I have to step up and over the side of the boat into the ocean with everything in my arms. I can't see, no flippers and no air. And then I have to go into the ocean, put my weight belt on, turn on my air, start breathing again, put my fins on, put my mask on, clear it, and do that all in 5 minutes. And while I was doing this, I was thinking, how could this possibly be useful in the world? And what I walked away from it over and over, dialing it in and being able to do it under 5 minutes, was this realization that these types of activities that push your physical and your mental limits are the types of exercises that we need to navigate in this world, whether it's in the ocean or in the policy realm. So it was a very visceral way of getting connected and thinking about what do we need to survive, literally survive in this space.
Wow. That is such a vivid and terrifying story. I'm seeing the whole thing. I'm seeing you on the edge of the boat with all of your gear and then have to do this so quickly and everything. That's really such a great way of starting off and giving all of us a sense of how it began. And you mentioned something too, Amber, about advising policymakers. And that has been another hallmark of your work, advising policymakers, crafting policy in this area. You're a specialist and an expert in this area. And you're also, of course, a PhD scientist. What advice do you have for listeners who may be interested in getting involved in the policymaking process, either on the inside driving policy or influencing it from the outside? Maybe just starting, how do you break in? How do you jump into the water?
For me, it was understanding that there was a disconnect between science and policy, and that inspired me to want to make better connections. And so my advice to people who are thinking about this is, what inspires you? What problem are you trying to solve? What do you care about? What excites you about this type of work? Is it helping policymakers get access to more information? Is it creating knowledge that you want to share with the world? There's so much for you to think personally about what inspires you before you step into this role. And for stepping in, for breaking in or jumping into the water, it really takes a little bit of courage and some persistence to break in. Just like it took me to get the bailout right, I had to have the courage to step over the side of that little rocking, floating boat in the ocean, and then the persistence to keep practicing. And I was able to break into the policy realm through just asking for opportunities to engage. So when I went to graduate school to learn how to be a scientist, and I wanted to learn how to be a scientist so that I could help be a connector of science to policy, I worked with some of my professors to get invited to some of the meetings that they were going to. So this was my trick. These professors were being invited to help set up a network of marine protected areas in California. And there were a lot of important meetings that were happening with these scientists from different institutions. And some of the professors were part of this process. I wanted to be in the room. I wanted to learn about what they were doing, and I wanted to get connected. I was just a graduate student. So how would I get into that room, get invited to these closed door meetings? I offered to take notes. They didn't have anybody to take notes. And so it was perfect, because then I was in the room and I was happy to take notes for them and distill it down for them and be of service to them. And I got to meet them and hear the discussion. So that's one way that you can break in. Another way that I think is that I have tried, and I think it's worthwhile, is to think about where you want to plug in to the policy process. So there's so many different places along the spectrum of the policy process. And then you can also think about whether you want to connect at the local government level, the state government level, federal or international. And the good news is that there are meetings that are being held that are public. So I wanted to better understand how policy was working at the state level and also the federal level. So I started attending meetings. And again, I had to be brave, because this was the time before Zoom. So we were going in person, and I would sometimes show up and not know one person. And I would introduce myself to the person I was sitting next to, and I would listen, and I would continue to go, and I would slowly start to get to know people and start to understand what the priorities were and see how everything was connected.
I love that. And some of the elements that you mentioned that really stand out for me are persistence. Before that, finding out what's your passion, what really energizes you, because it can be difficult to break in. You have to be persistent. But if you feel like this is really what you want to be doing, this is really important work, you find it meaningful, you're energetic, then you're more likely to really push through those obstacles. And then you had to be creative too, taking notes. And you mentioned distilling down the information. That's not an easy thing to do. But the more you are in these environments, you can start to zero your attention in on the stuff that's most important, but you don't really know in the beginning. So you were getting education, providing a service, and just getting immersed in this. And as you point out at the end, building these relationships as well. So just wonderful. And it can be a mosaic to try to get all these different pieces And it does take time. So thanks for sharing that. Really good advice on multiple levels. You're a skilled communicator, and at various times in your career, you've had to message science topics to the public. You've also advised policymakers on topics that can be very complicated. And of course, time is compressed and there is not a lot of airtime necessarily that you always get when you're involved with policymakers and staff members who are juggling a million different things. Over time, have you developed some go-to principles for doing this effectively? So, for example, messaging to the public first and then communicating with policymakers, frameworks or guidelines you have as a result of knowing what works over the course of many years of your experience and work in these environments?
There are a few go-to things that I start with, whether I'm thinking about messaging to the public, though I don't do a lot of that. I really do focus on policymakers. The framework that I use, at least as a starting place, is useful for both. And one of the first things I ask is, who is the audience? And when we say public isn't a monolith, so really thinking about, are we talking to students? Are we talking to families? What's the demographic of who we want to connect with? And what do they care about? That's one. And then where do they get their information? Who are their trusted sources? And those are definitely transferable in the policy landscape. And this understanding of the trusted source is really key here. And switching over to how policymakers get information, I start with those same steps as well. And then I go a little bit further because, like you said, policymakers are so busy. They're inundated with information and they have many competing priorities. So really understanding what their priorities are, talking to their staff is one of the most powerful ways to do that. And staff are often the ones who are writing the drafts and really engaged in the policy process. And I know that because I was staff and when I was a fellow. So joining a fellowship program is a great way to get experience doing this, or doing an internship with a government entity or an organization connected to government, like the California Council on Science and Technology. It's great ways to learn about how to do this. And then you get to see inside what information is really useful for policymakers. When I was in grad school, I wanted my research to be policy relevant. And so I would write that it was policy relevant for establishing marine protected areas. But I didn't know what that meant until I was on the other side of the table as a recipient when I was a Sea Grant Fellow in Sacramento and also in Washington, D.C. And people were coming to me with information. And I was thinking, this isn't what I need to inform the work that I'm doing. They don't know what our policymakers care about. And the information they're providing isn't targeted. They haven't done their homework. And doing your homework before you connect with the policymakers to learn as much as you can, and then having those engagements with staff can be really illuminating to target the information, craft the information, or connect in a way that's really going to matter for these policymakers. We already talked about the importance of relationships, but I'll reiterate it here because with policymakers, relationships really matter. Of course, they are looking to get information from trusted sources, and these are publications, so news outlets, media, as well as people. So we want to think about how to expand the network of who these policymakers trust as resources and amplify and elevate voices of scientists who don't always have a chance to connect. So helping to build connections, build relationships, these take time and they take really doing your homework to get it right.
Yes, so many nuggets, Amber, in that response. It is surprising being on the other side of it too, when you get these folks coming in the office. And I always tell people now, you got to research and reach out because you don't know what's important. And with this whole constellation of issues that these offices are dealing with, to demonstrate that your pet issue, even though it seems like it's the most important thing to you, is not going to be the most important thing to an office unless you've done your homework and figured out why it should be. And then you start to flip the dynamic. You're not just making a request, you really become a resource because you're providing something that the office wants. They want to be active in this area for a variety of reasons. It's an issue the boss has worked on for a long time. It's really interesting to me because you saw it from both sides as well, when people were bringing you information that they might have been very passionate about, but for one reason or another, it wasn't something that was going to get on the action agenda in your office.
That's exactly right.
And you touched on this too, Amber, about trust. And it's such a hard thing and it's earned and It's built over time and it's emotional, right? And many feel an instinctive emotional connection to the water and to the environment. Maybe it's wired in our DNA from prehistoric times. People gravitate to the water. Clearly, growing up, you did, and that shaped your outlook professionally. Do you, and if yes, how do you convey information that maybe invokes this emotional dimension that many feel towards the ocean and towards our waters?
It's connecting with people as humans. I love this question because even though I'm not an expert in evolution, I do think a lot about what drives us to care about water. And I can absolutely tell a story. I don't know that this is a story based on facts, but that being near water is safety for us. It's a source of food and we need water to survive. And so being drawn to it, just viscerally drawn to it, makes sense for our survival. And human connection is the same thing. We need to connect with each other to survive and create community. And so thinking about connecting in a way that you're inspired. And so telling stories, I think that's one of the best ways to connect and learning about people, being honestly curious about them and what they're inspired by is a really powerful way to remind ourselves that this emotional dimension and our connection to water, in this case, water, but to anything that you care about is really important.
You started to go to these meetings and you didn't know people. You started to introduce yourself. And you also mentioned how you really listened to folks and over time built up these professional rapports with them. And this kind of connection started to happen more and more. And since I started really working with scientists, I've always been struck by this kind of challenge because it seems to me, as someone who's not a scientist, that general scientists are trained to avoid emotional aspects in their writing and presentations. It's about the data for the most part, right? But decision makers, and you have been in the middle of this as well, decision makers, including the public, are actually influenced greatly by emotion. And emotions play such a big role, and trust be at the center of that. Do you think that scientists can authentically invoke emotion in their communication while still staying true to the science?
It's a challenge for sure. And certainly I was brought up as a scientist, as you said, to be fact-based, not to advocate for a particular policy outcome if I'm getting involved in policy at all. We think a lot about that here at the California Council on Science and Technology. We don't have a position, a policy position, but we want science and technology to inform policy. At the same time, you're exactly right. These topics that we're diving into, we're working on disaster resilience. This means we're thinking about COVID and wildfire and California meeting its carbon neutrality goals because our human existence is at stake. So how do we help policymakers make really tough decisions that come at a cost? What do they need to be informed, not only informed, but supported in those decisions? And this is where a whole network of organizations and people need to be involved. And everybody in every organization has a unique role. And so we maintain our credibility and independence by focusing on the facts. And there are a number of organizations that then take those facts and then they can advocate for a policy outcome that they're focused on. And if you're a scientist and you're thinking, how do I fit in? You have to ask yourself that question of what do you want to achieve and how do you want to be known as a scientist? Sometimes you need to spend time developing your reputation as a scientist before you step into advocating for some outcome, or you can just learn about science and jump right into an organization that allows you to really be an advocate.
Great advice. And you mentioned the California Council on Science and Technology. Of course, you've been the CEO of this dynamic organization for the past 10 years. Tell listeners about the organization. And then I'm also going to ask you about your recent exciting career news.
As an organization, it was created in 1988 as a resource to California policymakers. It was modeled after the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. It has such an incredible network of expertise. Our board of directors has representatives from our partnerships with the University of California, all 10 campuses, the California State University, the community colleges. We have Stanford, Caltech, US. We have Department of Energy labs, including Lawrence Berkeley Lab, Lawrence Livermore Lab, Sandia Lab, and SLAC down at Stanford, and 2 NASA labs, NASA Jet Propulsion Lab and NASA Ames. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of knowledge in California. There's so many other institutions that are creating knowledge we can tap into and translate in an effective way for policymakers. So then this just gets back to our audience. So we have a very focused audience of California legislators, California executive branch decision makers, and the governor's office. And so we work with them to understand what they care about, when they need information, how they need it, and then we connect our network and translate that information. So to give you an example, we can't be all science and technology to all policymakers. So we've focused in recently on a disaster resilience initiative. And this is a way for us to deliver what we're known for, which is peer-reviewed reports like the National Academies, convenings where we can bring policymakers together with experts to facilitate not just knowledge transfer, but this relationship building, this trust building. And we can offer briefings on emerging topics that policymakers want to better understand. When they are inundated with information and they don't know which information is the most credible, we can be there to help answer those questions. We do that one step removed through the briefings that we offer. We also have this great program that I am so incredibly proud of. It's a fellowship program, and this is separate from our work on peer-reviewed reports and convenings and workshops. It's a program where we recruit scientists and engineers. These are Ph.D. scientists and engineers for a year of government service and leadership training. They come to California. They might have already been here, but they might have come from somewhere else in the nation, and sometimes even in the world. We do accept international applicants, and they work directly with the policymakers. And this is what I was really lucky to do when I was coming up in my career after I finished my PhD. And it's such a powerful way, not only to blow open the doors of your career if you're interested in this, but to have a real impact. And in California, it's the 5th largest economy in the world. Yet Sacramento, where the policy center is, the capital of California, it's really a small town. And you can work side by side with the people who are making policy that affects California and the nation and the world. It's such an incredible landscape. This fellowship program that was created 15 years ago, I think, is one of the best ways to very directly connect science and policy, because our policy fellows are in the room with the policymakers, and they now become trusted sources that can react in real time to these policy needs. So one of the things that I'm most proud of after 15 years of this fellowship program is that the fellows themselves who have completed the fellowship, we have 10 to 15 each year, have stayed connected to California and the fellowship program. And they are the ones who come and they train the next cohort of fellows, and they serve as mentors, whether they're mentors because they are hosting fellows themselves, because now they're in leadership positions in state government, or they're outside of state government and they're serving as informal mentors. Such a powerful network. And I think it's changing the community here, because we have had over 150 of these PhDs come through this program so far in just the last 15 years. And I see this really evolving in the community, where there's more scientists in these leadership roles pulling science in at the policy level, at the leadership level. I also want to note that in California, the executive branch agencies have deep expertise embedded within their organizations. They have many, many scientists who create knowledge within the organizations themselves. And so we are just a complement to that knowledge, the expertise that resides within the state. That's not exactly true in the legislature. So that's where we really have been able to add science advice and science capacity in the legislature, because our fellows often get hired into personal offices and committees there. The other thing that I'm really proud of is that this fellowship program is serving as a model for other states in the nation. So this is a success when a program that you've been working on for many years can be replicated somewhere else. It can be scaled. Like ours has grown, but it's also being replicated. And we can share what we've learned, all the things that we've gotten wrong, all the things that we've worked to improve with these other states. There are over 20 other states that are thinking about or have already created similar fellowship programs that are targeted to the state needs of the state that they're in. And that is something that I'm really proud of in terms of how we think about continuous improvement and we have this growth mindset. We're always learning. We're always thinking, how can we do this better? Oh, that didn't work how we wanted it to. How do we learn from that? How do we fix the problem, not the blame? And this is a piece of advice I offer to people who want to be involved in policy, is that it is a complex system. It is ambiguous. It is difficult to understand. It can be opaque and it shifts constantly. And so building your own comfort with that ambiguity, that uncertainty, that flux, and learning from it and constantly asking, how can I do this differently? How can I do it better? Is a really effective way to stay in this and make an impact. And that's when we are recruiting our fellows, that's who we're looking for, or at least looking for ones who want to learn to build those skills. The last thing I'll say about the fellowship program that it makes also very proud is that we have figured out a way to sustain it going forward. And that is to build an endowment for it. And this is something that I've worked on for the past 10 years. And we just finished capitalizing a $30 million endowment for this program that will fund in perpetuity 8 to 10 fellows so that we always can be delivering science and technology advice to California policymakers. And that durability is so important and it's so difficult to achieve in a landscape that's continually changing.
So inspiring. And congratulations on completing that capitalization and ensuring this continuity. I know from many years of working with science and technology policy fellows on the federal level that the addition of that expertise is indispensable. And it's one of the reasons I got into doing what I do, to make sure that scientists have a voice and know how to use it in different rooms where it may be the language is different and the norms are different, and really making that happen in California and then having it replicated is an amazing achievement. So thank you for doing that, Amber, and your team.
Can I say more about?
Yeah, please.
So the only way this is possible is because we have an incredible team of people, both within CCST and beyond, who are champions of this and have been working for more than 15 years to make this possible. I've only been at CST for 10 years, but I joined as a volunteer 15 years ago to serve as a member of the selection committee for the fellowship program. So this is another tip for anybody who wants to get involved: volunteer to participate in activities like this. And I was invited to be a member of the selection committee because I had been a fellow and they wanted somebody who had experience as a fellow. And that just, again, opened the door to work with these amazing people who have come together over the years to deliver this. And that's the strength of CCST. And that's the piece of it that I am really proud of and feel so confident now that we have achieved these big goals for the fellowship program, for the organization itself. You're thinking about how strong it is now, this professional team of people working here. It has a wonderful processes in place. It's been delivering incredible impact through the reports and engagements we've been producing. We're about to release a wildfire report looking at the connection between wildfire forest management practices and human health and smoke. There's a lot that needs to be done in this space, and we are at the cutting edge of this. We recently released an overview document of the energy policy landscape. That's a great primer for people who want to understand California energy policy. This was targeted towards the California legislature because a whole bunch of new legislators just recently joined the legislature, and new staff may not have all this background information. We've also been releasing recommendations on how to do a better job in the COVID landscape. Like, what did we learn from this pandemic and how can California be more resilient? So I'm just so proud of all the people who are connected to CCST within our wonderful team, and all of the partners, all of the experts who donate their time, who want to make a difference and are willing to connect policymakers here.
Thank you for that. Really gives listeners a sense of the energy, the dynamism, and the value of the organization. And we're talking right now in August 2023 at a moment of real excitement for you personally, professionally. You are about to take on a new role as Managing Director, Chief of Strategic Partnerships at the California Academy of Sciences. I know the Academy has an ambitious new mission, and you will be right in the middle of that, helping to guide it. What can you tell listeners about the California Academy of Sciences, Amber?
I am so excited about this. It is bittersweet leaving CCST. But as I was alluding to, I feel like this is just the perfect time. The organization is strong. It's ready to go. I can hand off my leadership baton and through this transition to my deputy who's serving as interim CEO, Sarah Braid. She is phenomenal. And CCST is going to be in great hands. And so for me in my career, I've been inspired by the opportunity to help build organizations and help organizations transform. So when I learned about this role at the California Academy of Sciences, and I learned that this institution, which has been around for over 170 years, is rethinking its mission, that it's not just studying the natural world, it's not just educating people about the natural world through its incredible natural history museum, its living rainforest, its coral reefs, its planetarium, all of the amazing things that are in the institution itself. It is pivoting in such an incredible way to regenerate the natural world and to reverse biodiversity decline. And I love the idea of coming into an organization who's going through a transformation like this, who is taking on such a big vision and challenge and helping to think through what are the strategic partnerships in California, internationally, in the private sector, with philanthropists, with policymakers that can really galvanize this new mission. I don't start until end of October, but I'm already super excited about it. And again, I know that what will lead to success here is thinking about how to bring people in, how to build champions, how to have people connect in a way that they're passionate about this mission. And I have so much to learn. That's the other thing that really inspires me is I get to step back into my ecology roots and also learn a whole bunch of new information and create new partnerships, work with new people. And that is what really inspires me to take on this next challenge.
Wonderful stuff. Inspiring sometimes is overused, but this has been such an inspiring conversation, Amber, to hear your passion and the results that you've achieved and how you've gone about it and how you've nurtured generations of scientists and generations of scientists to come to get more comfortable and then take on leadership roles within policymaking environments, which is something I personally believe we really need. We'll, of course, have links to CCST that accompany the show notes, as well as the California Academy of Sciences, so listeners can find out more about those two vibrant organizations. Dr. Amber Mace, it's been wonderful to have you here. So fascinating to hear your perspective and your enthusiasm and your energy for the future. Thanks for taking time out of your really busy schedule to join us today.
Mark, it has been absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And listeners, thank you for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.